don't need a mic because I talk really loud, and if you need coffee before, you won't need coffee anymore because I'm a loud talker. You're welcome. They should have had me up first. My name is Keith Townsend. I'm the principal and co-founder of the CTO Advisor, strategic IT company, and we help IT vendors get out their message. You might have seen the CTO Dose on either YouTube or Twitter, etc. Visit the website. It's ctodose.com to check out some of the interviews that I've done. We're actually a couple of the sponsors of TECHunplugged, so I appreciate the opportunity to come here and talk to you about container orchestration landscape. This is one of those areas that, as IT infrastructure professionals, we're kind of interested in, where we looked at it. Containers are a thing one day, not so much the other. So I thought I'd start the conversation talking about what are the drivers for containers. If you've been in IT for any point of time, we remember the OpenStack days. This concept that cloud, just got through talking about it, that we're going to build this private cloud in an enterprise that we can extend out to the public cloud, and we have this multi-cloud environment, this hybrid cloud. It's going to be controlled by OpenStack, and things are going to be great. You know what, for various reasons, from a technology perspective, from a vendor politics perspective, from an open source project perspective, it all just flamed out. And this container movement was kind of birthed out of the failures of OpenStack. The idea that we can give developers these compact environments that they can put on their laptops, generate code, package that code, take that same package and run it in enterprise IT infrastructure at scale. At the end of the day, IT infrastructure professionals, all we want to do is create infrastructure, whether that's on-prem, in the cloud, software-defined, hardware-defined, it doesn't matter. We just want to create infrastructures that our developers and application teams consume. I talked to a big Fortune 500 size professional services firm. They spent a lot of time deploying Microsoft's pre-Azure stack platform globally. Spent millions of dollars deploying it. At the end of the day, no one came. The experience wasn't what developers looked for, therefore they abandoned it. The hope is that container and container orchestration allows for this easy application development, application deployment, application management infrastructure. So we create the application on a laptop, package it, send it to a cloud orchestrator to either run on-prem, off-prem, or a combination of the two, and we can manage the infrastructure in a way that we're accustomed to, or at least we modernize our infrastructure operations in a way that's manageable. I've had customers build fabulous applications in the cloud. Go to turn those applications over to the infrastructure team to manage, just for the infrastructure team to say, no thanks, too much of a snowflake, we can't manage this because we don't have the team and the resources to do that. Cloud orchestration or container orchestration is the hope that we can get past this barrier of easy development alongside of easy management. And I use the term easy lightly. So first, let's talk about the orchestrators of orchestrators. What's the big picture? Who's the big major players in cloud and container orchestration? The big guys are Kubernetes, and we'll talk about specifically a subset of Kubernetes. There's kind of a branch off in the Kubernetes space. We're talking about Amazon's web services. I'm lumping they have a couple of services. They have an Elastic Container Service. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then Azure Container Services. We'll talk about that, which is also a little different. Then also we have Mesosphere, we'll talk about Mesosphere. They're a data center orchestration tool, and then Docker Swarm. So first, let's talk about the non-Kubernetes play, because this is kind of like the precursor to Kubernetes, and Kubernetes has more or less kind of taken all of the air out of the conversation. Even the non-Kubernetes platforms support Kubernetes today, or there's plans for support of Kubernetes. So let's get out the non-Kubernetes platforms out the way first. Mesosphere, which is 4 years ago, the most exciting vendor in this space. Mesosphere had very ambitious goals. Their idea was to create a single data center out of multiple, or not a single data center, but a single compute layer out of an entire data center. So the idea was to abstract away the data center so much that instead of developers and operators programming to storage, compute, and networking components individually, like, I have my VMAX away, I have my HDS, my Hitachi HDS, I have my VNX, all different layers of storage, along with HPE compute. Compact is gone, so that dates me a little bit. I love using Compact as an example. I love that platform. But Cisco, Dell, all these different layers of compute, all these different layers of interface. Let's create a single interface, a single API to the data center. Containers was just a subset of that strategy. So Mesosphere has always had this idea of container orchestration. So strong that Netflix actually adopted Mesosphere as part of their container strategy. Instead of adopting Kubernetes, Netflix built their own container orchestration platform called Titus. I highly recommend just Googling Netflix Titus. Netflix did a great job of putting out about a 25-page paper on Titus. It talks about their journey to containers, some of the drivers they had when it comes to why they wanted to package their applications with containers, manage them, some of the operational challenges they ran through, all very much applicable to your container journey. If you're thinking about doing containers, while we sometimes look at hyperscalers like Netflix and say, oh, you know what, our data center isn't like Netflix. Netflix had a lot of challenges that looked a lot like the challenges that we have in the enterprise. Second non-Kubernetes player in the space is Docker. So I went to DockerCon EU. Developers love Docker. I was at DockerCon EU, and some of the tweets were, I wish we stopped talking about these old man technologies and talk about the new stuff, which is containers and building applications, and why are we talking about modernizing applications when we're just talking about greenfield? Well, Docker learned that, you got to pay the bills somehow. Developers don't have a pocketbook. The operations guys, the infrastructure guys are the ones who are able to sponsor these types of projects and move them forward in the enterprise. And container, with the onset of OCI for the base container image, there has to be value over packaging applications in containers. That value is Docker Enterprise Edition. And part of that package, when you purchase Docker Enterprise Edition, is Docker Swarm. It is the container orchestration platform. We'll just leave it at there's a lot to want when it comes to Docker Swarm. It's just not, when you compare that to Kubernetes, it's just not as mature and not as feature-rich as the Kubernetes platform. So this can be interactive. If you have questions during this presentation, raise your hand. We can have a conversation. But that's it that we're going to talk about, the non-Kubernetes platforms as it pertains to their features and capabilities. We'll revisit both Mesosphere and Docker Swarm, I think, a later point in the presentation as they pertain to Kubernetes. So these are the platforms that we're going to talk about from a Kubernetes perspective. OpenShift, VMware PKS, Docker Swarm, I still misspelled Swarm, SWAM. It happens. AWS EKS, which is in preview, Azure Container Services, and Google Compute. Just a note, when you're presenting, if you ever have to present, if you have a projector at home or in the office, do this. This is like you find stuff that you never find until you actually present. It's weird. So let's first talk about OpenShift. Who's heard of OpenShift? One person. Well, two people. Oh, three, thank you. I mean, OpenShift has been around a while, much longer than the Kubernetes brand. Matter of fact, when OpenShift started to talk Kubernetes, it confused me a little bit because I'm like, wait, hold, isn't OpenShift a Red Hat's PaaS platform? How is it now a Kubernetes distribution? For those of you who don't know, I think I kind of fast forward conversations a little bit. Kubernetes itself is an open source project originally sponsored by Google. Google has always run containers at scale. They've open sourced their that back end process and back end set of tools and provided that to the CNCF, the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, which is hosted by the Linux Foundation. And now, just like Linux and other open source projects, the community can take upstream versions of that and create their own distributions. You would probably never ever take Kubernetes and deploy the upstream yourself without support. I think Kelsey Hightower has a book out called Kubernetes the Hard Way. So if you want to really experiment, but like in production, you would probably go to one of these vendors we just mentioned and get full support for Kubernetes. Red Hat, being the open source company, is their top tagline, came out with support for Kubernetes with OpenShift. The thing to know about OpenShift is that it predates Kubernetes. It is a platform as a service. It competes directly with Pivotal Cloud Foundry. If you've heard of Pivotal Cloud Foundry, one of the Dell Dell Technologies companies, it is a ready-made, what we call an opinionated PaaS. You bring it in-house, you bring Cloud Foundry developers in, and they're able to get started up and running. You don't have to look out and buy these PaaS microservices that like SAML, for authentication. You don't have to look at message buses and determine what APIs you're going to make for message buses. These PaaS platforms make it super simple, but they're opinionated, which means that developers have to do it this way. OpenShift is one of these PaaS platforms. They have adopted Kubernetes as their container orchestration platform. So if you want platform as a service and you want to build your applications in containers, you choose something like a OpenShift, and then that also comes with container orchestration support with Kubernetes as that backend. So the ideal is to hopefully throw a bunch of this overview information to you guys. If you have questions, again, pause. We can have a conversation, we can talk through it, but we only have 25 minutes, and we're going to go through an awful lot of vendors in that short period of time. VMware PKS. So I've had a conversation with these guys. And for an extended conversation, I think it was almost 20 minutes. Go to the CTO dose. I challenged VMware on this. When I think of containers, and I think of cloud native technologies, I don't think of VMware. I think of VMware for my steady state, VMs, DRS, HA, Oracle stateful applications. When I think of containers, I'm thinking of stateless applications, the ability to bring up stuff, break it down really fast. So VMware has a really complicated cloud native story in general. They have Photon OS. They have VMware integrated containers. They have now VMware PKS. The PKS stands for Pivotal Kubernetes Service, I believe is the acronym. How does all of that fit together? That's on the video. You can watch that together. But the idea is VMware's concept is that there's no better infrastructure to run containers on than a vSphere virtual machine infrastructure. Earlier on in the container conversation, we had this debate in the industry. Did it make sense to run containers in VMs or to run containers in bare metal? I think today that conversation is over. It makes sense unless you just need the pure performance. It makes operational sense to run containers inside of VMs. We cannot recreate all the tools that we shouldn't go about recreating all the tools that we've created in our virtual machine infrastructure just for containers natively. If we look at all the big cloud providers, they're not running these containers on bare metal hosts. They're running them inside of VMs. If we look at Netflix and their Titus project, they're not running containers on bare metal. They're running them in EC2 instances. One of the advantages they found with running containers on top of EC2 is that they became much more efficient with EC2. One of the problems with EC2, t-shirt size instances. And you can't carve that up. You can't thin provision EC2. However, if you run containers on top of that, you can become more efficient with the EC2 instances that you do have. So a side benefit for Netflix and Titus was a cost savings because they were able to run their EC2 environment more efficiently. So VMware is saying the same argument, that basically if you adopt their Kubernetes compatible solution, VMware PKS, that you can now run your containers on top of VMware and use all of the features that you're accustomed to using, DRS, for overall VM mobility. If you have long-running instances, you can use VMware integrated containers for a Docker-compatible interface. And then, of course, it integrates hopefully nicely with Pivotal Cloud Foundry and that whole, which is, I think, is a curse word, BOSH integration. People have passions about BOSH. If you don't know why, just Google the term and you'll find people are either very for it or very against it. All right, Docker Swarm. Swarm spelled the right way on the slide. Thank you. So, again, Kubernetes has taken up all of the press. I write for TECHunplugged.com. If I was to write about Docker Swarm by itself, that probably wouldn't get much interest, not from a container orchestration perspective. Docker has announced Kubernetes support, and what they're doing is really interesting. One of the great attributes of Docker Swarm is simplicity. Docker Swarm is designed for developers to run in production. Docker Enterprise Edition in general is designed for developers to adopt this and become operators themselves. They've taken this ideal of simplicity and added it to Docker Swarm for Kubernetes. In theory, it's just a couple of configuration settings, and now your Docker Swarm cluster, because Kubernetes and Docker Swarm form clusters, and inside the clusters there's pods, there are some equal mappings, there's some unequal mappings, but to oversimplify it, is that basically, if you have Docker Swarm infrastructure already, you can enable a Kubernetes cluster on top of your Docker Swarm cluster. So it's literally a right-click type of operation, say enable Kubernetes, and now one of the frustrating parts of Kubernetes management is taken care of, which is upgrading and maintaining Kubernetes. You know, companies like Platform 9, Normata, companies I haven't put on the side, make hay out of managing Kubernetes. If you guys remember the early days of Linux, if you remember the frustrations of OpenStack, going from one version of the solution to another one was a pain, and in some cases still a pain in OpenStack. Kubernetes, not too much different. Going from Kubernetes is, I think, 1.10, I think, is in preview or beta. So we're very young in the Kubernetes movement. We've heard a lot about it, but Kubernetes just went production. CNCF just graduated to a production project, I think, just a few weeks ago. So from a operations perspective, it's not a proven commodity to say that I can go from version 1.1 to version 1.2 to version 2.0. So a lot of these companies where they're adding value, Nomada and Platform 9, and now Docker with Swarm is saying they're promising a seamless experience from an operator perspective. Operating the actual infrastructure required to run these platforms becomes easier if you adopt an overall solution like Docker Swarm. That's about it with the value of Docker Swarm. So other than, you know, promising API compatibility with both Docker Swarm and Kubernetes, that's the Docker Swarm story. More interesting, to me at least, is AWS EKS. It was announced at AWS reInvent 2017. People are really excited about this. Again, if you look at what Netflix has done with Titus, which is to take EC2 instances and become more efficient with it, AWS is promising big things with EKS. EKS is not even in, I think EKS is right now, yeah, it's in preview right now. So most customers don't have access to it, but AWS is promising both private and public cloud Kubernetes management. So in theory, you're getting this hybrid cloud experience directly from AWS. So the AWS Kubernetes cluster is hosted inside of AWS, inside of EC2 instances. So AWS is going to allow you to size your Kubernetes cluster. It's going to be backed by some EC2 instances. They'll install Kubernetes on that. You'll be charged for both the Kubernetes management and the compute needed to run the cluster. But in theory, that cluster can control resources, pods that exist inside of AWS. So pods based on EC2 and pods on your private data center. AWS doesn't like to use the term hybrid cloud at all, but in theory, this is a hybrid cloud where you're having resources on your private data center managed by a Kubernetes cluster living in AWS. That is the promise. Again, it's in preview, so I can't comment one way or another if that's the actual effect. What AWS does have in production, and they still push it pretty hard, is their ECS service. It's the Elastic Container Service, which again is backed by EC2 instances. It has a separate API than Kubernetes. This is important. You know, AWS is known for this lock-in. They give you a service that's so great that you use it, you adopt it, you build a application and business on top of it. Google or Azure or Rackspace or any one of these other companies come out with a competitive service, you can't move to it because you're locked into the AWS API. ECS is similar to that. If you want cloud-based containers on the biggest cloud provider in the world. Your only production option right now is ECS, unless you went the route of Netflix and adopted your own container platform. You can do that in a Kubernetes distribution. You can go to OpenShift. You can go to VMware and go PKS and deploy these things and just consume AWS as an infrastructure as a service. This is where the driver's at. It commoditizes the cloud. The API to your cloud becomes Kubernetes instead of the AWS API or the Google Compute API or the Azure API. You're programming to Kubernetes, and Kubernetes democratizes the cloud. You can run, I don't care if the VM is running on VMware vSphere. I mean, I don't care if the container is running on VMware vSphere. I don't care if the container is running on EC2. I don't care if the container is running on Google Compute. It's a container. It's managed by Kubernetes. Kubernetes controls where the workload is placed. Just as long as I program to Kubernetes, I'm fine. ECS doesn't give me that flexibility. That's the big drawback of ECS. All right, we're coming to a close. And you guys haven't asked questions, so maybe we'll get back on track a little bit. No, I'm still a minute over. All right, so Azure Container Services. There's not a lot to say about this. This is like, surprisingly, we don't give Microsoft credit. This is like the first cloud compatible, like Microsoft announced out the gate, their container service is based on Kubernetes, and it's Kubernetes. Not much to add. Kubernetes managed service. It is backed by Azure VM instances, pretty straightforward. And the same thing for Google Cloud. You would expect this. I almost forgot to add them, but this is a proper presentation. Google Cloud supports Kubernetes. So again, proper container service based on Kubernetes. The cluster lives in Google Cloud. You can use that to run. You can add. You set up the networking VPN, and you can manage pods that exist anywhere. It's Kubernetes. So this may sound like a commercial for Kubernetes, but the reality is that Kubernetes has taken pretty much the air out of everyone's sail. Everyone has started to back it, from Mesosphere to Docker Swarm to even AWS. All of the major cloud providers are part of the CNCF, the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, which hosts the Kubernetes project. You want to find out more about me? TheCTOadvisor.com. On Twitter, I'm at CTO Advisor. If you guys have any questions, I'll be here most of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.